Count 1, murder in the second degree. Guilty of murder in the second degree.
She was not violent. She was a regular teenager. And she was well raised and brought up with loving family. And her life mattered.
A car crash, a plea for help, a gunsh. In November 2013, these three events collided in a tragic sequence that ended the life of 19-year-old Renisha McBride. Her story shook the nation and sparked debates on race, gun violence, and the meaning of self-defense. So, what happened on that night? Why did she knock on a stranger's door? Why did the stranger feel threatened? And what happened to Renisha after the man opened the door? Stay tuned as we attempt to find the answers to these questions in today's video. This is the story of the unfortunate young girl who lost her life only because she asked for help. On that fateful night of November 2013, 19-year-old Renisha was driving through the suburbs of Detroit. She was a vibrant young woman, full of dreams and potential. Friends described her as kind-hearted and always ready to lend a hand. But around 1 a.m., her car veered off the road and slammed into a parked vehicle. Dazed and confused, Renisha stumbled from the wreckage. Her phone was dead. She was alone in an unfamiliar neighborhood. Blood trickled down her face as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Desperate for help, she began knocking on doors. Little did she know, her search for assistance would lead her to a fatal encounter. As Renisha wandered through the darkness, another soul lay sleeping, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. Theodore Wafer, a 54-year-old man, rested peacefully in his small house in Dearborn Heights. He lived alone, his quiet life about to be shattered by a desperate plea for help. Around 4:30 in the morning, loud banging erupted at Wafer's door. Renisha, disoriented and injured, had finally found a house with lights on. She pounded frantically, hoping someone would answer. Inside, Wafer jolted awake, fear gripping him as the noise moved from the side of his house to the front door. Convinced he was under attack, Wafer reached for his shotgun. With trembling hands, he loaded the weapon and crept towards the door. The banging continued, each thud increasing his panic. In one swift motion, he flung open the main door while keeping the screen door closed. There, on his porch, stood a figure in the darkness. Without hesitation, Wafer pulled the trigger. A single, deadly shot rang out, striking Renisha in the head. She collapsed instantly, her plea for help silenced forever. As the echoes of the gunshot faded into the night, a community was left reeling from the shocking turn of events. The quiet suburban street, once peaceful, now buzzed with the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. Neighbors peered out their windows, trying to piece together what had happened. Within minutes of the shooting, Theodore Wafer made a frantic call to 911. His voice trembled as he told the operator, "I just shot somebody on my front porch." Emergency services arrived quickly, but it was already too late for Renisha McBride. She lay motionless on Wafer's porch, her life cut short by a single blast from his shotgun. As the sun rose on that November morning, news of the tragedy spread like wildfire. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. A young woman, seeking help after a car accident, had been gunned down on a stranger's doorstep. How could this happen? When reporters spoke to a few neighbors, they all seemed shocked and in disbelief.
Justice has to be served somehow. If somebody lost a life, basically from my point of view, he seemed like a good guy, nice guy. I mean, nothing against him whatsoever.
Do you think he meant to kill her?
I don't think so.
The police investigation began immediately. Officers combed the scene for evidence, trying to make sense of the senseless. Wafer, still in shock, told them he thought multiple people were trying to break into his house. He claimed he didn't even know the gun was loaded, that the shot was accidental. But as investigators dug deeper, questions began to surface. A ballistics expert examined the shotgun and found nothing wrong with it. The gun could only have fired if someone pulled the trigger. This revelation cast doubt on Wafer's story of an accidental discharge. As details of the shooting emerged, so did information about Renisha. She was just 19 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. Witnesses reported seeing her wandering the streets earlier that night, disoriented and bleeding from a car crash. They guessed that was intoxicated and confused, desperately seeking help in an unfamiliar neighborhood. The community was in shock. How could a plea for assistance end so tragically? Protesters took to the streets, demanding justice for Renisha. They couldn't understand why Wafer had been released without charges initially. The case quickly gained national attention, drawing comparisons to other high-profile incidents of perceived racial injustice. Renisha's family was devastated. Her aunt, voice heavy with grief and anger, told reporters, "I want justice for my niece. I don't want this guy walking around." The family's pain was palpable, their loss unimaginable. As the days passed, the incident sparked intense debates about racial profiling and gun violence. People questioned the wisdom of stand-your-ground laws and the consequences of easy access to firearms. The media coverage was relentless, with pundits and commentators hours dissecting every aspect of the case. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy took notice of the growing public outcry. After careful consideration of the evidence, she made a decision that would change the course of the case. "We do not believe he acted in lawful self-defense," Worthy announced, as she brought charges against Wafer. The charges, second-degree murder, manslaughter, and a felony firearms charge, sent shockwaves through the community. For some, it was a step towards justice. For others, it raised questions about the line between self-defense and criminal action.
This morning, Kim Worthy, the Wayne County prosecutor, instituted the 3 charges that you're all aware of. It was second-degree murder, manslaughter, and the use of a firearm in the commission of a felony.
As the case moved towards trial, the nation watched closely. The tragic death of Renisha McBride had become more than just a local incident. It ignited a national conversation about race, fear, and the value of human life. The quiet suburban street where it all began would never be the same, forever marked by the night. A young woman's cry for help was met with deadly force. Renisha's family held a funeral, which was attended by all her friends, family members, and well-wishers.
Family members visibly shaken and overwhelmed with grief as the body of 19-year-old Renisha McBride is carried in a white casket out of the House of Prayer and Praise Cathedral in Detroit.
One family member expressed his grief and frustration and stated that McBride was in distress and looking for help, but it ended up costing her life.
Just imagine if you were out there and you had an accident and you were looking for help and nobody helped you and the help that you got ended your life. That's what she was doing. A 19-year-old baby just looking for help.
The other family members also spoke to the press after the funeral and said that they were only looking for justice.
We just want justice for Renisha. Okay, we don't want the attention. We just want justice.
The community held protests and demanded immediate action and arrest, but McBride's family said that they wanted everything to be done properly and lawfully, and they were willing to wait for it.
If you rush to things, then you don't get all the facts. And Kim Worthy, based on her past actions, she does things thoroughly. She waits until she puts everything together.
After all the facts were out in the open, the nation waited for only one thing: the trial of Wafer and justice for McBride. As Renisha McBride's life ended on Theodore Wafer's porch, the quest for justice was just beginning. The tragic shooting sent shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone wondering, was this a case of self-defense or cold-blooded murder? The answer would be decided in a courtroom where every detail of that fateful night would be scrutinized. The trial began with a packed courtroom, tension thick in the air. On one side sat Wafer, a man who claimed he was protecting his home. On the other, Renisha's grieving family, seeking answers and justice for their lost loved one. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a picture of that night's events. They argued that Wafer wasn't acting in self-defense, but was looking for a fight. He wanted a confrontation, they said, pointing to Wafer's own words about being mad and angry and full of piss and vinegar when he grabbed his shotgun. They emphasized that Renisha was unarmed, just a scared young woman looking for help after a car crash. But Wafer's defense team had a different story to tell. They claimed their client truly believed his life was in danger, but the prosecutors refuted it quickly.
So the first chance you had to talk to any law enforcement or to talk to 911, you said, I just shot somebody banging on my door, right?
That's what it says, yes.
Didn't say anything about a break-in, right?
No, I didn't.
Didn't say anything about you were afraid, right?
No.
Wafer's lawyer, Cheryl Carpenter, told the jury about the loud banging and prying noises that had terrified her client. He thought multiple people were trying to break into his home, she said, her voice full of conviction. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of conflicting testimonies and expert opinions. A forensic pathologist called by the defense, Dr. Werner Spitz, testified that Renisha had a concussion from the car crash. He suggested this, combined with her high blood alcohol level, could have affected her judgment that night.
During this trial, tried to convince the jury that Renisha was out of control, that she drank, did drugs, got in a car accident, and refused help before walking to Ted Wafer's house, that she was acting erratically and caused this.
But the medical examiner had a different take. They found nothing unusual on Renisha's hand, contradicting claims that she might have injured it while pounding on Wafer's door. The conflicting testimonies left the jury with a lot to consider.
Prosecutors convinced the jury Ted Wafer was the one out of control when he pulled the trigger from inside his house as she banged on his door.
The discussion of stand your ground laws added another layer of complexity to the case. Prosecutor Kim Worthy argued that Wafer's actions didn't meet the criteria for lawful self-defense. She said there needed to be an honest and reasonable belief of imminent death or great bodily harm to justify the use of deadly force.
Shoot first, ask questions later, right?
It was a threat, the threat that was coming in my house, yes.
As the trial wore on, emotions ran high. Wafer's testimony brought at least one juror to tears as he expressed remorse while still maintaining he acted out of fear.
I don't think we'd ever be here if the EMS showed up for her in the first place.
So this is all somebody else's fault, right?
It's not somebody else's fault.
You're the one who shot her, right?
Yes.
But there were inconsistencies in Wafer's story that the prosecution was quick to point out. He initially claimed he didn't know the gun was loaded and that it went off by accident. But during the trial, his story changed. Now he said he fired purposefully, but in self-defense.
On the night of the shooting, he heard pounding noise. He was afraid. He looked for his cell phone. He wanted to call someone, couldn't find the cell phone, and then he had to get his gun. He had forgotten that he had loaded the gun, and yet he opened the door to see what was going on, and that's when he shot Renisha McBride.
Law enforcement testimony added another twist. They said the damage to Wafer's screen door likely came from the shotgun blast itself, not from someone trying to break in. This contradicted Wafer's claim that his door had been tampered with before he fired. Renisha's family members were heartbroken when her sister gave the victim impact speech. She said that she was devastated to lose her sister, who was nothing but a wonderful person inside out.
Renisha was a beautiful young lady with her whole life ahead of her. She was a goofy person with a smile that would light up any room. Renisha was smart, kind, and loving, and a family-orientated person. For me, she was more than just a sister. She was my best friend.
And they were upset that Wafer hadn't felt the need to apologize for taking away an innocent life even once so far.
I was taught to apologize when I made a mistake or an accident. Never once have I heard Mr. Wafer send his condolences or apologize to my family for taking our loved ones. I find it very hard to believe that his actions was an accident.
For 9 intense days, the courtroom was a carousel of testimonies, evidence, and arguments. Both sides fought hard, presenting their cases with passion and conviction. But in the end, it would be up to the jury to decide. As they filed out to begin their deliberations, the question hung heavy in the air. Would they see this as a tragic misunderstanding or a criminal act? As Renisha's desperate search for help ended in tragedy, the search for justice was about to begin. The community held its breath, waiting to see if Theodore Wafer would be held accountable for the young woman's death. After 9 intense days of testimony and arguments, the fate of the case now rested in the hands of 12 jurors. The jury didn't take long to reach their decision. In less than 2 days, they emerged with a verdict that would send shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Guilty on all counts: second-degree murder, manslaughter, and a felony firearms charge. The pronouncement fell like a hammer, leaving Wafer visibly shaken.
Count 1, murder in the second degree. Guilty of murder in the second degree.
But why did the jury come to this conclusion so quickly? Legal analysts pointed out that the inconsistencies in Wafer's story didn't sit well with the jurors. They saw through the cracks in his story and decided that he was indeed guilty.
That was no accident. That was not self-defense. He did murder.
There was no emotion shown on Theodore Wafer's face, and after 7.5 hours of deliberating, the jury agreed with prosecutors that Theodore Wafer was lying about critical details to save his own skin.
When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was thick with tension. Wayne County Judge Dana Hathaway didn't mince words. She handed down a sentence of 15 years for second-degree murder, plus 2 years for the gun charge. 17 years total. At 55 years old, Wafer would be spending a significant chunk of his remaining years behind bars.
Going to be sentenced to 2 years for the felony firearm conviction, which will be consecutive to the murder in the second degree and the statutory manslaughter convictions, which will run concurrent to one another. For the second degree murder conviction, I'm going to sentence you to 15 to 30 years. For the statutory manslaughter, 7 to 15 years.
During the trial, Wafer had eventually tried to express remorse and apologize to them.
This poor girl, she had her whole life in front of her. I took that from her.
Family and friends
of Renisha McBride, I apologize from the bottom of my heart. And I am truly sorry for your loss.
The verdict and sentence sparked a range of reactions. For some, it was a step towards justice. Others felt it wasn't enough. McBride's family voiced their pain and frustration.
She was not violent. She was a regular teenager. And she was well raised and brought up with loving family. And her life mattered.
They think 17 years is too long. That's not enough. He should have got life. He would get out and be able to still live at 72. My niece will never even see 21.
Legal experts saw broader implications in the verdict. It sent a clear message. You can't just shot someone for knocking on your door in the middle of the night. Judge Hathaway echoed this sentiment, stating firmly, you cannot murder someone for simply knocking on your door in the middle of the night. But the legal saga wasn't over yet. After the verdict, the defense attorneys requested the judge to let Wafer stay out of jail on bond until his sentencing.
Cheryl Carpenter wanted Wafer to remain free on bond until sentencing.
It would be more of a risk to his safety and everybody's safety if you do remand him right now to the Wayne County Jail. I don't think that's a safe place.
But the prosecutors argued that the verdict was already made, and there was no point reverting it.
Your Honor, he's been convicted of second-degree murder. I think the jury has spoken.
But defense attorneys still argued that Wafer was inherently a good man, and it was safe to let him stay out because he wasn't a criminal and wouldn't harm anyone.
This was a very, very unique case, very unusual situation. He didn't go out of his house looking for this. It's not somebody who's going to go on a rampage if you let him out here. This is a quiet, introverted man, Your Honor, who is now been convicted of murder too, but that doesn't change who he is, and he won't change, Your Honor, in these 2 weeks.
After deliberating for some time, the judge and jury agreed to not send Wafer to jail, but ordered him to stay in custody in another facility. McBride's family was satisfied with the verdict. They understood that people were allowed to carry weapons, but they couldn't fathom why they would have to take people's lives when there were no apparent threats.
People have a right to bear their arms and everything else, but you have to do it with reason and responsibility, you know, not just murder somebody, you know, when it's not justified.
Wafer's defense team also filed an appeal later, arguing that being sentenced for both second-degree murder and manslaughter violated double jeopardy. The Michigan Supreme Court agreed on this point, overturning the manslaughter conviction. However, this legal victory was hollow. When Wafer was resentenced, his total prison time remained unchanged. The case of Renisha McBride and Theodore Wafer had become more than just a local tragedy. It had ignited a national conversation about the value of human life and the limits of self-defense, and questions lingered about race, fear, and the use of deadly force. As Renisha's tragic fate unfolded on that porch, the ripples of her death spread far beyond Dearborn Heights. The nation found itself grappling with uncomfortable questions about race, fear, and the consequences of a gun-toting society. The case lit a fire under the gun control debate. People wondered if a shotgun was really necessary for home protection. Critics pointed out that Wafer could have just called 911 instead of reaching for his weapon. The ease of grabbing a gun seemed to have led to a needless death, but it wasn't just about guns. The fact that Renisha was black and Wafer was white added another layer to the tragedy. Some folks started asking hard questions about racial bias. Did Wafer see Renisha as more of a threat because of her skin color? It was a touchy subject, but one that couldn't be ignored.
When this happened, it was compared by many to the Trayvon Martin case because Renisha McBride was an unarmed black teenager. But even Renisha's family members today say they don't feel that this is about race. Her aunt told me this is about a man who shot first, asked questions later, and later was too late.
The incident also put stand your ground laws under the microscope. Wafer claimed he was defending himself, but prosecutor Kim Worthy wasn't buying it. She argued that Wafer didn't have an honest and reasonable belief of imminent death or great bodily harm. This case made people think twice about what real self-defense looks like. As the dust settled, communities started talking about better ways to handle situations like this. Maybe there were nonviolent solutions that could have saved Renisha's life. People wondered if better emergency emergency response systems could have helped her after the crash. The case of Renisha McBride was a wake-up call for many and became part of a larger conversation about justice, race, and violence that was echoing across the country. The tragedy that unfolded that night left more than just a family grieving. It sparked a firestorm of questions about race, guns, and the value of a young life. Renisha McBride's story didn't end on Theodore Wafer's porch. Her memory lived on, fueling a movement for change. Renisha's family refused to let her death be in vain. They set up a foundation in her name, fighting against gun violence and racial profiling. Her aunt spoke at rallies, her voice raw with emotion. We want justice for Renisha, but we also want to make sure this never happens to another family. The case forced people to look hard at their own biases. Why did Wafer see a threat instead of someone who needed help? It wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about a whole system that made such tragedies possible. What did you think of the case? Do you think gun laws and access are getting out of control in this country? Do you think Wafer actually acted in self-defense, or if it was an accident? Do you think McBride would be alive if she'd gone to another neighbor for help? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.